Hi, you're watching 101. We're talking with Shashi Tharoor. Shashi, you've obviously met a lot of world leaders. You're involved in a lot of high-level diplomacy. What would you define as those moments that really made a difference in your life in that kind of work?
When I joined the UN way back in 1978, if I'd said to my seniors at that time, look, I'm joining an organization that I believe will one day be conducting elections in sovereign countries, that will be sending human rights monitors to intrusively inspect human rights in sovereign states, that will be essentially taking leaders of countries off to sit in The Hague in a jail cell to be tried by foreigners for things they've done to their own people, that will impose sanctions on the entire import-export economy of a medium-sized member state, etc., etc., and I can give you 10 more examples. My seniors would have said to me, young man, what have you been smoking? I mean, this is not the organization that the UN is. This is not what we are. We're an organization of sovereign member states. We don't interfere in this way. And yet all these things I've said to you have happened in the course of this one person's career. And that transformation is the larger picture that I'd like to bring to you as an answer to your question. It's watching the way in which the world has adapted to the need to have a credible set of international mechanisms universally supported, which every country belongs to and every country has a stake in, that can actually deal with problems that really face humanity collectively.
But that's what I'm wondering, essentially an outsider, part of a collective body, but as an outsider, how do you build that relationship with world leaders to the point where, you have to obviously try to implement some kind of, universal law or international agreed law, and yet on the other hand, you're also building personal relationships. How do you balance the personal and the professional relationships you have with these leaders?
I think there's always a need to respect the fact that world leaders are human beings just like yourself. I mean, they have their position, the authority that comes with it, the resources that come with it, but ultimately they're not fundamentally different from you or me or whoever is watching this program. They're human beings. They are capable of the same sorts of passions, the same sorts of irrationalities, and the same sorts of human qualities. The light touch works just as well for them and amongst them as it does with you and me. Professionally, though, in an organization like this, you are talking about people who stand for their countries. And very much what the UN accomplishes is often the sum total of the foreign policies pursued by individual world leaders heading individual governments. And for the UN, and this is the great challenge of the Secretary General and of his staff, including people like me, is to somehow remember the larger collective interest of humanity out of the interactions of these national interests.
But how do you make a mark as an individual in an organization like the UN when there's a lot of cynicism about what the UN is, that it's lumbering, it's a dinosaur and so on? How do you counter that and still carry on and move forward?
It's perhaps not the right way to look at it, in the sense that, yes, the UN as an organization is a mechanism of which every one of us as individuals is a cog in a wheel. Some cogs perhaps larger or more highly placed up the wheel than others, but essentially the organization is the faceless body that people like to either praise or attack, and these days more often attack. And yet, yes, we do tend to forget that there are individual human beings whose actions add up to this. It's complicated by the fact, is that the UN is both a stage and an actor. It's a stage on which the member states are playing their parts, declaiming their differences and their convergences, speaking for their governments. But they're also the United Nations. And then it's an actor in the shape of the Secretary General and his staff, who are there to execute the policies agreed by the member states, but using their own personal skills, talents, and qualities. And that balance is one that's very difficult to strike.
Now, one thing you have managed to do is build trust within the UN circles. And I wonder, as you've come to a position, as you say, quite a tricky one. Public information and communication is obviously at a time when the communication industry is changing. So going from an industry where, like you say, you sat with a typewriter and were typing out, now obviously you use computers, but there's the internet, there's blogging, there's SMS text and so on. How well are you able to keep up with technology?
With great difficulty. I mean, one of the things about modern communications technology is that everything adds on to what was there before. It never replaces it. I mean, the phone call never replaced entirely the letter, the fax never replaced the phone, the email never replaced the fax, and so on and so forth. So you have a number of new things to have to deal with, and I think, frankly, they just add hours to your day. But I struggle through 400 emails a day, but I do try and keep up with them. We get digests of blogs about the UN and see what people are saying about our organization. We, of course, have to deal with all the other means of communication that you rapidly listed. And at the same time, we have to also deal with the traditional media, because it's important for us to remember the audiences in the developing world for whom the UN is very often the one source of support and assistance in a number of challenges from development to humanitarian action. So we try and do all things simultaneously. We try to be on radio, we try to be on TV, but I'm pleased to say our website got more than 2 billion hits last year, which makes it one of the most successful websites in the world. And we crafted that really with no additional resources from member states, just cobbling it together from existing resources in the UN. We're very proud of that. So we're trying to do more with the same resources.
All that technology also means you can never really escape the job. There's no quiet lunches, nothing. So again, to what extent does that crank up the pressure on you personally?
The BlackBerry is a wonderful device, but can also be like a ball and chain around a prisoner's legs. You simply can't entirely get away. And I think that is something which today is much worse than a few years ago. I mean, as recently as the 1990s, I remember a situation when Boutros Ghali couldn't be reached at a time when there was a plan for NATO to bomb in a particular part. They simply couldn't reach him because he was unavailable. Today, no one is ever unreachable. And that, I think, is an extraordinary transformation in our times, and adds to the pressures under which and the stress under which world leaders work.
So what do you love about your job? Or do you actually hate it?
No, I have to say I do love it. I look forward to coming into work every morning. First of all, I love the fact that everything that comes across my desk is a matter that interests me. I mean, I've never felt the way I sometimes used to feel about math homework as a school child. You know, I mean, it's always something that interests me. Second, and I suppose this is where a certain amount of the individual ego issue comes in that you've talked about, you do have a sense with some of the things that you're doing of being a human being, leaving a small corner of your smudgy thumbprints on the footnotes of the pages of history. But we at the United Nations are dealing with issues that ultimately shape the world that our children and grandchildren will inherit. And that is a sense that I think gives us a sense of pride and responsibility for what we're doing. So that's why I think it's worth paying the price. One can't pay that price indefinitely, but it certainly is a price you take on because of that satisfaction.
But you're quite cocooned in the United Nations. You're in America, you're in New York, but you're quite cocooned in this environment. How did your life living in America change post September the 11th? I know in one article you wrote, it's now driving while black and is now flying while brown and so on. How were you differently received afterwards?
First of all, I'm not sure I shouldn't take exception to your suggesting I'm in a cocoon. None of us in the UN can afford to be in a cocoon. We interact with people wherever we are, and we travel a lot and interact with people wherever we go. So I would like to think I have a strong sense. I still go to my ancestral village, a crumbling 200-year-old house in the middle of paddy fields in Kerala, and meet villagers whose only language is Malayalam and who speak to me with my much less adequate vocabulary about the United Nations and the world and so on. And these are all issues that matter, I think, around the world. But having said that, yes, 9/11 affected all of us because as long as we're working at UN headquarters, we are New Yorkers. This is the community within which we serve. And there is no question, first of all, that it was an assault on all of us. What happened on 9/11 took victims from 80 countries. So it wasn't just an attack on America. It was an attack that showed a callous indifference to the lives of people, Muslims and non-Muslims, from 80 countries around the world. And I think all of us felt personally violated because we could have been there. Many of us knew people who were victims there. I did too. And so that was something I think very, very strongly all of us felt. But equally, of course, the reactions in the immediate society. My own son was shouted at by some ignorant person as he was walking back from school. He was in school in those days. You know, you dirty Arab, go home where you came from and that sort of thing. Okay, he wasn't Arab, but I mean, he took the insult as one that everyone of a certain complexion will share. And that was something that I'm very glad to see declined after a few months. It was only a few months of great tension that came from people feeling vulnerable and insecure, which is what leads them to react the way they did. And I would say that that's part of the lesson we learn for the rest of the world too. Many of those who conduct actions of violence and indeed of hatred, verbal violence as well as physical violence, are often acting themselves out of insecurity, vulnerability, a sense somehow that they are living in fear. And if we can tackle that, alongside the very necessary law and order actions that tackle terrorism, if we can also tackle that sense of fear and vulnerability, we'll go a long way, I think, to ending the awfulness that 9/11 symbolizes.
You already have a number of acclaimed books. I'm sure there are more on the way. What do you think you will be remembered for?
I'd like to think that the book that I will be remembered for hasn't been written yet. Otherwise, frankly, going on to find the time, carving out at Sunday midnight would be a challenge. I still believe, as a writer, that, thanks principally to the priority my work has taken, that I've not yet been able to bring the best out of myself. And I'd like to think that some years down the road, I will find both the time and the space inside my head, which is even more important, I think, for a fiction writer, to write a novel that people really will be moved by and which will touch them. And that's certainly going to be my attempt over the next God knows how many years.
Well, I read once you wrote that time is your enemy. We wish you more victory against time, and having met you at the half century, hope to see you again at the full century.
Thank you very
Shashi,
much,
thank you
Ray.
very
All the
much.
best.